Morning. If you would, go ahead and open up your Bibles to James chapter 3. James chapter 3. Starting in verse 2, it says here, "For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouth, that they may obey us, that we may turn their whole body. Look also at ships. Although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. Even so the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature and is set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter for the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs?" So this morning, as you can kind of tell about from the text that we just read here, we're going to be talking about the issues of the tongue. You know, the old saying goes that sticks and stones can break my bones, but names can never hurt me. Well, if we think about that, really, on the contrary, it can be the opposite. Because even though it's talking about a physical pain here, or physical damage, when he talks about sticks and stones, but yet, when he talks about how names, in other words, words, they can do a lot of damage. They can also take someone's life if they go too far. Few things get us in trouble, but really not so many things as what the things that we speak can actually get us in trouble. There's lots of things that, we can say about someone or something, and it's, before we know it, we just opened up a can of worms, and then it just goes from there. But taming the tongue, that is probably one of life's greatest challenges. And in fact, it's probably easier to tame a stubborn, wild horse than it would be to tame our own tongue. So, realizing the difficulty and the consequences of the things that we speak, right here in the book of James, he addresses this issue right here. Now, speech is a beautiful and helpful thing when it is used constructively. When you hear great poetry spoken of someone, you're like, well, that sounds so beautiful. That is just a work of art. By the way, Dr. Seuss, best ever. So, when you think of great speeches that have been given by such people like Abraham Lincoln when he gave the Gettysburg Address, you also think of great sermons that have been preached by pioneer preachers. And what I mean by pioneer preachers, men like Guyan Woods or N.B. Hardeman or Barton Stone and Moses E. Lard and Alexander and Thomas Campbell, which, by the way, these men here did not start the Church of Christ simply because they were not alive in Acts chapter 2. Just throw that in there. When you hear words of like a mother, when she is talking to her daughter and trying to explain to her about modesty and about how to conduct herself. Also words of comfort that we give to someone who has lost a loved one, or someone who is probably going through a divorce at the time. That's such a hard time in our life. Words can have a tremendous effect during that time when we talk to someone. So we can see here, speech, it's a beautiful thing whenever we use it correctly. It can be very helpful, but also at the same time, our tongues in so many ways can inflict irreparable damage and pain to others. Like, for instance, when we read here in the book of James, he illustrated here that how a ship, how so large it is. You see ships today, how large they are. They're actually just kind of like a big sail. Wind can catch them and it can just blow them wherever, but still yet, they are actually steered and controlled by just a really small rudder, which actually has more control over it than the wind does. How great a forest a fire kindles. When you probably heard on the news sometime, someone who probably just threw just a cigarette butt out the window, and it being so dry, how later on it just burned up hundreds of thousands of acres, just from that little bitty cigarette butt just being thrown out. If it wasn't thrown out, then never would have happened. I also think of another illustration. It makes me think of like a nuclear missile, because nuclear missiles can do such tremendous damage. And the thing is, once they're launched, they can never be called back, because once they're gone, they're gone. They're going to go to their target. And that's the same way with our words. Once we speak those words, we can't call them back, because they're gone. And so just as like how the military goes through several checks before they launch a nuclear missile, they go through several checks to make sure to authenticate that order is valid, they validate its authenticity. And they go through several checks, through several people, in so many ways. And, really that is kind of how we ought to think about how we use our words. Before we speak something, even though we might kind of be in a little bit of a rush to say it sometimes, if we just take a few moments or a few seconds to just go through all the checks that, what is what I'm about to say going to do? How's it going to affect this person? Is it going to be remembered as something that came from me? I mean, you know what I'm talking about there, that, we need to go through our mind and go through several checks before we launch that missile. Social media. It is a huge, huge source of words that can do a lot of damage. When you put posts out there, or you've seen posts out there, people who reply to that, some people reply to that with such filthy language. Because what it did is it may have pricked their heart or something, but it really got to them, and it really made them mad. Enough where they have to talk real filthy back. They have to just say something. They just can't hold it back. They just have to let it out. And so just words, you see the power that words have. Also lawsuits that are, tying up our courts today over some things that people just say. They say something that somebody will say, well, I'm going to sue that person for that, or, for defamation or whatever. There's even lawsuits out there that are tying up our courts that are just over words, when they could actually be taking care of real, actual crimes. There are also useless arguments that have been so easily spoken, things that we just said that, turns into an argument. I've been there before myself, when really I should have kept my mouth shut. And really, sometimes these arguments, they just don't get you anywhere. And you think you're going to say something, and it's not going to accomplish anything. You think it's going to make you feel better, when really by the time you're done, it didn't do a thing. Church splits have occurred because of someone's loose tongue. Murders have happened out of anger because someone could not keep their mouth shut. They just had to keep on running their mouth. Wars have been fought because a country will not keep its pledge to another country. And so, as we look at all these things here, I'm sure there's many more examples that I could give you, and probably some examples you're thinking of that I hadn't mentioned. But, we ought to face it that our tongue is probably our biggest weakness. It's probably the source of half, maybe most of the problems that we have. In the book of Proverbs addresses a lot when it comes to speaking with a loose tongue or an unbridled tongue. Proverbs chapter 6. If you want to turn your Bible over to there and kind of keep your thumb there, as we'll be going back to this book a few times. Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 16. Proverbs 6:16. It says here, "These things the Lord hates, and 7 of them are abomination to him: a proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that are swift into running to evil, a false witness who speaks lies, and one who sows discord among the brethren." And if you notice here in these 6 abominations here, 3 of them involve the use of the tongue. When he talks about a lying tongue, and also a false witness who speaks lies, and one who sows discord among brethren. That ought to go to show there that how much damage that our tongue can do, how much trouble it can get us in, because it's mentioned there's 3 things that involve it right there that are abominations to the Lord. The tongue is dangerous in so many ways. Let's say, for instance, gossip. It's kind of one thing that maybe might be hard for maybe some of us to avoid because, we kind of like hearing things about other people, which really we ought not to. But when it comes to gossip, you hear of stories on the news when you hear someone in their teens who was probably gossiped about at school, had rumors spread about them, and then later on you found out, or they had on the news, the reason why that was on there is that they took their life. Because they were just, I don't know, they were just so embarrassed or what, but some of them have even taken their own life just over words that were spoken. And back here in the book of Proverbs in chapter 20 and verse 19, Proverbs 20, verse 19, he says here, "He who goes about as a talebearer reveals secrets. Therefore, do not associate with one who flatters with his lips." Now, when it says reveals secrets here, secrets are information that is kept private for a reason. And so what does a talebearer do? They go about telling everybody what that secret is. And so if there's a reason why they're not wanting that information out there, then that we ought to respect that. Also, in chapter 26, verse 20, 26, verse 20, he says here, "Where there is no wood, the fire goes out, and where there is no talebearer, strife ceases." And so the idea that we get here that if there is no wood, the fire goes out. Well, if there's nothing that is out there that is being said about someone, then strife ceases. If we don't add any more to it, it'll eventually will go out. Also in chapter 18, verse 8, Proverbs 18, verse 8. It says, "The words of a talebearer are like tasty trifles, and they go down into the inmost body." Kind of just like, candy. When you think of your favorite candy, when someone has that, you really want that pretty bad. And that's kind of like how gossip is to some certain people. It really appeals to them, and they're just like, ooh, gotta have that. I really want to probably hear what's going on. And so that's kind of like how gossip is. It's just kind of like candy. It's just something, it's not good for you, but something that a person probably really desires. Also, chapter 11, verse 13. Chapter 11, verse 13. And he says kind of the same thing again here. "A talebearer reveals secrets, but he who is of a faithful spirit conceals a matter." Even though there is a secret that someone may hear about someone, a faithful person, what they will do is they will not let it go any further. In fact, they will actually conceal it. And by when we conceal it, as we just read, where there is no wood, the fire goes out. And so if we do not go about adding to it, well, eventually, whatever is being kept secret, then eventually that will, hopefully go away. If you would turn your books over, or Bibles over to Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12, you can still keep your finger there in the book of Proverbs in the vicinity of it. Matthew chapter 12, verse 36. Now Jesus says here, he says, "But I say to you that for every idle word men may speak, they will give an account of it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned." So, good advice right here. The more we keep our mouth shut, the less we're going to have to give an account for. So, but that's something we ought to think about when we say something. If it has something to do with someone else, like I say, go through the checks and remember one of those checks that what you're about to speak to that person or what's could possibly pass on is going to probably, it's more likely going to be something you're going to have to give an account for in the day of judgment. And I know all of us, including myself, we've got enough to answer for, and we don't need to add just one more thing on top of it. When it's something that is so easily that that we can actually hold back. So, which this right here leads us into the next sin of the tongue, which involves lying. In the book of Acts chapter 5, we see the story about Ananias and Sapphira. Starting there in verse 1, it says, "But a certain man named Ananias with Sapphira his wife sold a possession. And he kept back part of the proceeds, his wife also being aware of it, and brought a certain part and laid it at the apostles' feet. But Peter said, 'Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit, and keep back part of the price of the land for yourself? While it remained, was it not yours to own? And after it was sold, was it not in your own control? Why have you conceived this thing in your heart? You have not lied to men, but to God.' Then Ananias, hearing these words, fell down and breathed his last. So great fear came upon all those who heard these things." And this fear right here that it talks about, the things that we are hearing, these words, even this about what he's saying about here about lying, we ought to at least still have the same fear today. And I know it's not quite as easy because we don't see no physical evidence of anyone physically dying in front of us. But we see right here how God really feels about lying. In fact, he mentioned that in the Proverbs chapter 6, verses 16 through 19, when 3 of those things had involved with the tongue. So these Ananias right here, he had just fell dead. So we see that it's no wonder they had fear come upon them, because they see how God feels about that. Going on in verse 6, it says, "And the young men arose and wrapped him up, carried him out, and buried him. Now it was about 3 hours later when his wife came in, not knowing what had happened. And Peter answered her, 'Tell me whether you sold the land for so much.' She said, 'Yes, for so much.' Then Peter said to her, 'How is it that you have agreed together to test the Spirit of the Lord? Look, the feet of those who have buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out.' Then immediately she fell down at his feet and breathed her last. And the young men came in and found her dead, and carrying her out, buried her by her husband. So great fear came upon all the church and upon all who heard these things." So that's, something we ought to at least keep in mind when it talks about lying, that if we were in their shoes at that time, that would happen to us right now if we're about to tell this lie that we're about to say. Even though, as Christians, that is something we definitely strive not to do. But as being human, we know we're not perfect, and there are times that our tongue is going to be unbridled. Psalms chapter 19. Psalms 19, verse 9. It says, "The fear of the Lord is clean enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. And so God still feels the same today as he did at the same day when Ananias and Sapphira fell dead because of the lie that they have told. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 15. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 15. Now Peter says here, he says, "But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other people's matters. So yet, if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter." So you notice here the things that a busybody, being involved in other people's matters, the category of the things that it is listed here with, it is listed the same as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer. And to us, that may not seem, saying something may not seem as evil or as bad as that, but yet God feels the same about lying as he does these things here that I just mentions. In Revelations chapter 21 and verse 8, ought to give us a considerable amount of fear. When he says, "But the cowardly, unbelieving, abominable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death." So we see here that lying, sometimes it may not seem so much to us, as that old saying goes, a white lie or something. It may not seem all that big, but really, this right here is the magnitude of how God views lying. Cursing and swearing is another sin that our tongues can do. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 8. Colossians chapter 3, verse 8. Now, Paul here, he gives some good advice. He says, "But now you yourselves are to put off all these things: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth." And so we as Christians ought to have those things. We're to put those things away. And if we're ever going to shine as a light, we cannot be speaking those things. As James just said earlier, he said, how can how can salt and fresh water flow from the same source? In Luke chapter 6 and verse 45. Luke chapter 6, verse 45. If we are saying those things, if we were speaking filthy language, where does that come from? And Jesus says here where it comes from. He says, "A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks." And so if anyone who would be committing these sins, such as gossip, lying, cursing, and swearing, we see here where that comes from. It comes from the man's heart, because he says here, "For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks." So if that is in our heart, then how did it get into our heart? If you turn to Mark chapter 7, verse 20. That's Mark chapter 7, verse 20. Jesus says here, "What comes out of a man that defiles a man? For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within and defile a man." So we see here that it is from within the heart where these things come from. So if it comes out of the heart, whether it be in word or whether it be something that we do, whether it be in word or deed, if it comes out of the heart, then how did it get into our heart? Something had to let it in. And in Luke chapter 11, if you turn over just to a few chapters here, Luke chapter 11, I'm trying to get there. Luke chapter 11, verse 34. It says, "The lamp of the body is the eye. Therefore, when your eye is good, your whole body also is full of light. But when your eye is bad, your body is also full of darkness. Therefore, take heed that that light which you see is not darkness. If then your whole body is full of light, having no part dark, the whole body will be full of light, as when the bright shining of the lamp gives you light." So the things that, how it gets into our heart to begin with is that through the eyes, through the things that we are probably exposing ourselves to, whether it be something on TV, social media, bad company, when we let those things in, then we don't need to let it go any further. We do not need to let it come out, because if it comes out, as he says, that is when we will be defiled. Mark chapter 14. You remember whenever Peter, whenever he was denying the Lord 3 times, Mark chapter 14, verse 66. Mark chapter 14, verse 66. "Now as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, 'You are also with Jesus of Nazareth.' But he denied it, saying, 'I neither know nor understand what you are saying.' And he went out the porch, and a rooster crowed. And the servant girl saw him again, and began to say those who stood nearby, 'This is one of them.' But he denied it again. A little later, those who stood by said to Peter again, 'Surely you're one of them, for you are a Galilean, and your speech shows it.' Then he began to curse and swear, 'I do not know this man of whom you speak.' A second time the rooster crowed. Then Peter called to mind the word that Jesus said to him, 'Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times.' And when he thought about it, he wept." And so Peter here, he thought that the third time there, that if just by even cursing and swearing, just showing a really strong resilience that he does not know Jesus, he would think that that would eventually convince the people that he does not know them. But yet, there was something worse that happened. He realized he denied Jesus, and he said it verbally. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29, Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29, the Bible has so much to say when it comes about the words that we speak, or bridling the tongue. Paul here gives an admonition here. He says, "Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good and necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers." So, how can a corrupt word impart grace to hearers? So if anything that we're going to say, use it for the edification or for glorifying God is how we ought to speak. Now, also we need to think about the words that we speak can make us look foolish, especially when we're cursing. It is better to be, you know the saying, it is better to be thought of as a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. So if people may just be thinking about you, that's fine. But if you open your mouth, then they're going to be like, we know now for sure. In Proverbs chapter 29, verse 11. Proverbs 29, verse 11. It says, "He who troubles," no, that's not the right verse. I actually went backwards. I went to verse and chapter. 29, verse 11. "A fool vents all his feelings, but a wise man holds them back." That's Proverbs 29, verse 11. A fool vents all his feelings, but a wise man holds them back. You know, some people will say that with that anger and stuff you have inside you, they say it's best to just let it all out, get it out of your system. But you remember what Jesus said as we read a while ago. He says, remember, what comes out of a man defiles him. And so if what comes out of us defiles us and the eye is the lamp of the body, well, of course, then the problem is we should have never let it get in there in the first place. And so, as he says here, a wise man holds them back. So there is really a good benefit to holding those things back and not letting them out. Because if you let them out, you know what damage it's going to cause. James just told us what all damage our tongue, our words can do. Also in Proverbs 18. Proverbs 18 and verse 6. It says, a fool's lips enter into contention, and his mouth calls for blows. A fool's mouth is his destruction, and his lips are the snare of his soul. As Jesus said, remember, he said that for every idle word that a man may speak, he will have to give an account for it in judgment. So the best use for our tongue, as just read a while ago, is to use it for God's glory. In fact, if you see what Paul said in Titus chapter 2, verses 6 through 8, see what Paul says here. Titus chapter 2, verse 6. He says, likewise, exhort the young men to be sober-minded, in all things, showing yourself to be a pattern of good works, in doctrine, showing integrity, reverence, incorruptibility, sound speech that cannot be condemned, that one who is an opponent may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say about you. Wouldn't that be in a good position to be, that you didn't say anything, and even your enemies, they got nothing on you. They're just speechless. And so, that is just one of the benefits that we can get for just keeping our tongue bridled and not letting things come out. Colossians chapter 4 and verse 6. Paul also gives a good admonition here. Colossians chapter 4, verse 6. Paul says, let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. And not just knowing the answer of how we're to answer each one, but how we answer it, how we speak to them, also has a tremendous effect. So the solution here, when it comes to speaking with our tongue, by keeping our mouths shut, there are more benefits and good that is to be gained than opening our mouth and letting words out. We would not have to worry about wanting to retrieve those words that you wish you never would have sent out to begin with. How many of us have ever said something before in our past, and it keeps coming up in our mind time and time again, and we thought, man, I wish I never said that. I'm sure we all have something that we said that we would give anything to go back in time and just edit that, and wish we never said it. We would even pay probably $1,000 to edit that if we could. Just words that was spoken. Also, it is one less thing to be judged by, as we just read. So, all the things that we said, think about how much all that has been added up through the years. Proverbs 21:23. Proverbs chapter 21:23. Getting a little bit of a workout here this morning, turning through the pages. But the Bible has so much to say about this. Whoever guards his mouth and tongue keeps his soul from troubles. So it's one less thing that we'd have to be judged by if we guard our mouth. You'll be thought of more highly by others, showing that you have good self-control rather than being a fool or busybody. Also, another thing that we ought to do is pray to God to help us to bridle our tongues. Do not speak of what you may assume about someone. If it's not even true, if you're not even sure that it is true, what you know, and it is the subject of the matter of what you're speaking to that person, it's best to just not even say it. Because even if you do say it, even if it is true, what benefit is there going to probably be gained out of it? So keeping silence will be more profitable here. In 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 4. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4. He says here, love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself. It is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own. It is not provoked, and notice this, thinks no evil. If we have love, if we claim that we love our enemies, then it says love thinks no evil. So don't pass anything evil along about someone that you may not care so much about, but keep our tongues bridled. Also James chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, as we get to about to the end right here. James chapter 1. James chapter 1 and verse 20. No, I'm sorry, verse 19. So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. And what does the wrath of man do? He is actually quick to speak, and he is very slow to listen. So, tell the truth. When you are confronted with something, don't try to lie about it and thinking it's going to get you out of trouble right then. But really, it is better to tell the truth because it ends the matter right then, and then you don't have to deal with it coming up again later, because most likely it will, because then you'll also have a lie added on top of that, which you'll have to answer for. Like I said, also, you will be thought of as a wise person. In the book of Proverbs, chapter 10, verse 19, Proverbs chapter 10, verse 19, notice what he says here. In the multitude of words, sin is not lacking, but he who restrains his lips is wise. And also chapter 17 and verse 28. Chapter 17, verse 28. It says here, even a fool is counted wise when he holds his peace. When he shuts his lips, he is considered perceptive. So again, as that saying goes, better be thought of as a fool than open your mouth and remove all doubt. As the old saying goes, if we're going to say something, put your mind in gear before you put your mouth in motion. Just take a few extra seconds to go through the checks to make sure what you're about to say is not going to have tremendous damage, or even if you think it's going to be a little damage, isn't going to be worth mentioning. So make sure that our tongue is bridled and secure before we go on to say anything. And so I hope this lesson here this morning has been helpful and beneficial. If anything, reminds us of the things that the Bible says about bridling the tongue, that if we do keep our mouth shut most of the time, we are considered wise. And so if you have a need to respond to the invitation this morning, if you're not yet a Christian, you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, ready to repent of your sins, ready to confess him before men, be baptized for the remission of sins, we can help you with that here at this time. And if you are a Christian and if you need the prayers of the church, come as we stand and sing.